As regards foreign policy, the first question is, what role should the United States military play in the Middle East? And we'll start with Drew Christensen of the Republican Party.
I think the U.S. government and the U.S. military does have a role to play overseas, but I do think that the United States can intervene in a situation where our interests or where people's liberties and freedoms are at stake. There's been a lot of conversation, President Bush is demonized for the war in Iraq, and I think it's interesting that when President Obama came into office, he ran for president on the platform that he was going to end the war in Iraq. And President Obama took George Bush's timetable for withdrawal from Iraq, a 13-month timetable or whatever, and brought the troops home 1 month before the date President Bush said he was going to bring the troops home. So essentially adopted President Bush's plan for the war in Iraq, and I thank him for doing that, because I think President Bush's plan was a good one, and I congratulate the president on recognizing that and continuing it. I think whether you agree with the circumstances where we went into Iraq, I personally think it was flawed intelligence that created a situation where we couldn't make a good decision, but that's a matter for historians to decide. The fact of the matter is, the country of Iraq is better off than it was before we were in the country of Iraq. They were repressed by a brutal dictator, Saddam Hussein, who committed genocide and ethnic cleansing against his own people, killed an entire town of Kurdish people, and now Iraq is admittedly a fledgling, but a democracy in the heart of the Middle East. And now I don't think that's necessarily a model. It has turned out, I think, all right, and it's turned out better for the people currently living in Iraq.
Mike Lensegrav, Young Americans for Liberty.
I believe the U.S. military is far too involved in the Middle East. We spend way too much money and manpower on foreign nations' domestic issues, which do not directly affect us. What's even worse is our involvement in the Middle East has not made us safer, but rather exposed the American people to easily avoidable danger. Our government has a long and meddlesome history in the Middle East. This has resulted in what the CIA calls blowback. Blowback is unintended consequences of actions performed by foreign governments. In this case, we are the foreign government, and the unintended consequence is the animosity these people feel towards us. In 1953, the CIA executed a coup in Iran known as Operation Ajax, whereby the democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh was ousted from power and the Shah was inserted. The Shah was extremely unpopular with the Iranian people, but the US supported him and ensured that he remained in power for decades. During the Soviet-Afghan War, the US funded, trained, recruited, and equipped the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets. They later evolved into Al-Qaeda, who we are now fighting in the war on terror. So the US helped to create the enemy we now oppose in many countries. We even funded and equipped Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq war. So we're largely responsible for the animosity many Middle Eastern people feel towards us. Those people don't simply hate us for our freedom. They hate us because we meddle in their affairs. We need to let them work out whatever disputes they may have on their own terms.
Brandon Madsen, Socialist Alternative.
Well, I appreciate that Young Americans for Liberty made a bunch of the points I was going to make, so I can make other ones. I think on Saddam, the Shah, on the Mujahideen, I agree with all of that. That's all true, and that's a perfect argument for why all the arguments that were made for why it's necessary to go into the Middle East militarily, to go after terrorists, etc., are so flawed. That is not going to solve the problem of terrorism, and that's not the root cause. The reason that the anger exists is because of U.S. foreign policy. I also would strongly dispute the claim that Iraq is better off than it was before. Iraq was not some completely underdeveloped third world nation. This was a modern society, highly educated, and it has been bombed to smithereens, infrastructure destroyed, women's rights thrown back. there's been a tremendous worsening of conditions for regular people in Iraq. It's much less safe than it was before. This is not to support Saddam Hussein in any way. I think that the people of the US definitely should have supported movements to overthrow him from the bottom up, and I think that what we've seen happen in Tunisia and Egypt shows that perhaps they could have done that without the same loss of life that's occurred because of the US intervention. The US has all of the justifications offered, such as safety, democracy, etc. I disagree with.
Quentin Latham Kama, Democratic Party.
Well, I think the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were misguided foreign adventures. And I think that history will show that the Bush doctrine, view on the world, is fundamentally wrong and flawed. I think if the Arab revolutions have taught us anything, is that outside military intervention cannot and does not spur democratic change in a timely and reasonable way. I think our current policies in Iraq and Afghanistan are appropriate. We've ended the war in Iraq, and we are slowly transitioning out of Afghanistan. It's time for the Iraqis and Afghans to defend themselves. The United States needs to shift away from direct combat missions and to positions where we're only providing minimal training and assistance to our allies. As it pertains to Iran, I do not support any sort of military strike on the Iranian regime to end the nuclear program. I think our current strategy of economic sanctions is working. But with that being said, I think the United States needs to keep all options on the table when it comes to dealing with credible threats to national security that may arise from the Middle East.
Thank you. A more specific question along the same lines. What is your stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And we'll start with Quentin Latham Kama.
So I have to preference this that the Democratic Party is actually heavily split on this issue, on the Israeli-Palestine conflict, with some factions being extremely supportive of current Israeli policy and others being supportive of Palestinian independence. I'm very strong and support with Palestine in the quest for independence. I think that any negotiations that Israel and Palestine have must begin with the 67 borders. I do not believe there can be an independent, free Palestinian state with Israeli settlements in it. I think that a capital of a Palestinian state must include East Jerusalem. And I think that if a free and independent Palestinian state must exist, it must be completely autonomous from Israel. It must be able to control its own utilities, its own borders, and its own finances.
Brandon Madsen, Socialist Alternative.
Well, Israel is the top recipient of U.S. foreign aid, and that aid is mostly military in nature, and that's allowed Israel to function as basically a bulwark and a proxy for U.S. imperialism to carry out its agenda in the Middle East. So I think this is an extension of the question about the U.S.'s involvement in the Middle East. Gaza is the world's biggest outdoor prison camp, basically, stricken with tremendous poverty, despite having one of the most highly educated populations in the world. And the policy of Israeli occupation benefits only a tiny minority in power in Israel. It's not in the interests of most ordinary Palestinians or most ordinary Israelis. There are large numbers of people on both sides that want an end to Israel's oppression of the Palestinian population. However, I would say that in terms of national politics, this is something that as a whole, the Democratic and Republican parties are both 100% unified on this issue with one another. The only disagreements they seem to have with each other is over who supports Israel more. The people of the US should stand up and oppose their government's unconditional support of the Israeli police state, and should also join in solidarity with forces both in Israel and in Palestine that are trying to unify against the status quo of the current occupation.
Mike Lensegrav, Young Americans for Liberty.
I think in order to have an opinion on the matter, one must understand the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. The conflict started when Jews fled Europe en masse to Jerusalem, where they had historic origins in order to escape persecution during the Holocaust and World War II. The problem was that there was already a population of Arabs living in those lands. They were driven from their homes and villages, and as a result, several nations invaded the recently established Israel, resulting in the Arab-Israeli War, which occurred in 1948. By the end of the war, Israel controlled about 78% of the disputed territory, and most of the Palestinian refugees who fled their homes were prevented from returning by the Israeli government. Jews in Israel also have special rights to housing as opposed to the Palestinians, who make up about 20% of the population. Ever since the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel has been building settlements in Gaza and the West Bank. To build and maintain these settlements, Israel has destroyed thousands of Palestinian homes and seized their land. US-backed peace talks have gone nowhere and have actually enabled this illegal occupation of Palestine. In America, criticism of Israel is immediately met with claims of anti-Semitism by groups such as the Anti-Defamation League and AIPAC. In addition, these pro-Israel groups have much greater lobbying power in DC than pro-Palestine groups, so naturally our lawmakers are going to be biased towards Israel. Our government also gives Israel more foreign aid than any other nation, as Brandon mentioned. Proponents of Israel often claim that because Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, we should support them, but that fact is really irrelevant. What has Israel actually done for the United States? I can't think of anything major. I do support Israel's right to exist, however, but I do not support the occupation of Palestine or the inability to voice legitimate criticisms of Israel.
Drew Christensen, Republican Party.
I absolutely support the state of Israel. That doesn't mean I don't support a Palestinian state. I don't think you'll find a lot of people that aren't supportive of a two-state solution, like Quentin mentioned. The city of Jerusalem is problematic because obviously the Palestinians, who are predominantly Muslim, claim the Jerusalem as their own holy city, as do the Israelis, who are predominantly Jewish, also claim Jerusalem as their holy city. And I mean, not to mention Christians also, see Jerusalem as their holy city. So having it held in either Israeli, Jewish, or Palestinian Muslim hands would offend people on both sides of the issues. So I think there's probably a different kind of solution, international status for the city of Jerusalem, or some sort of a solution to that problem. With that said, I do think the United States should play a role in the peace process in the Middle East, and I don't think, as Brandon said, that we should, stand with forces in Palestine that support unification because Hamas supports unification, Hezbollah supports unification. Should we stand with Hamas and Hezbollah in their support of unification of Israel under their banner? I don't think those are the main forces in Palestine supportive of unification, as well as extremist groups on the Israeli side that would support unifying the whole region under a Jewish banner, or extreme Orthodox Jewish banner. Yeah.
Our last foreign policy question is a more general one. What role should the United States play in global affairs? And our first presenter is Brandon Madsen, the Socialist Alternative.
I just want to quickly clarify, I am not calling for a one-state solution to the Israel-Palestine. I think you need self-determination for any people that want it. But to move on to this question, I think the idea that's sort of commonplace in the political dialogue in this country, the sort of assumption that the U.S. is this beacon of progress and opportunity to the rest of the world, and that it spreads that to the rest of the world, is completely false. And I think most people see it that way around the world. I think most people correctly see the U.S. The same way that Martin Luther King Jr. did, as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Look at Latin America. What country has not been subjected to U.S. foreign policy designed to keep it complacent and open for business, meaning exploitation by U.S. multinationals? Look at the Middle East. What country there is not under continuous pressure to hand over oil at favorable prices? The U.S., as we already said, spends more on its military than does most of the rest of the world combined, and has a tendency to throw its weight around in constant military adventures, and yet the government has the gall to call it the Department of Defense. There's free trade agreements that are set up, and other countries are put under economic and military pressure to implement them. And I think all of these are issues where Democrats and Republicans have been largely complicit. on domestic issues, the parties often have to distinguish themselves so as to compete for different voting blocks. But I think on foreign policy, where the people affected don't have a vote, that's not the case. I think most regular people in the US and most regular people in other countries around the world have fundamentally the same interests. But I think the US military needs to stay the heck out of other countries around the world, and the US should stop meddling in these other countries around the world. It's only had negative consequences.
Thank you very much. Quentin Watham Akama, Democratic Party.
All right. Well, I think the United States must continue to be heavily involved in global affairs. Even though we are drawing down in Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't think now is the time for isolationism. The United States must continue to be a global leader, promoting the ideas of freedom and democracy across the world, while at the same time promoting development and investment in countries classified as least developed. The United States needs to continue pressuring tyrannical governments into allowing political and social freedom. If need be, the United States should work with its European allies to create financial sanctions and barriers to persuade the governments to. I also believe that I just want to say this: the United States should never ever engage in foreign adventures of nation building. No. When the acts of aggression or terror occur against the United States and its allies, the United States should work to build strong coalitions with our partners and build a consensus to tackle and combat such threats. The United States should never ever act alone unilaterally, because that has proven to have dangerous and disastrous results. I also think that as China rises and becomes a new global power, the United States must stand strong to defend our allies in Asia and from growing Chinese political and military pressure. In the near future, the focus will no longer be on the Middle East, but instead on Southeast Asia.
Drew Christensen, Republican Party.
I would also agree that now is not the time for isolationism. I think we've tried isolationism many times throughout our nation's history, and it doesn't work. If we isolate ourselves from the rest of the world continues to march on. Foreign isolationism goes hand in hand with economic isolationism, and economic isolationism is not free market, and it's not good for our economy. In addition, I do think the United States should be supporting democracy and freedom around the world. Where would the United States itself be if France had not sided with us in the Revolutionary War? If we were not supportive of overseas adventures in support of freedom? I'm not saying the French were necessarily in support of freedom. They had other interests to fight the British. But without engaging with the rest of the world, how are we supposed to support freedom and ensure other people's liberties outside the United States aren't threatened? Liberty is not a purely American ideal. Liberty is a human ideal, and the United States should use our global position to ensure and promote liberty for the rest of the world.
Mike Lensegrav, Young Americans for Liberty.
Thomas Jefferson wanted peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, but entangling alliances with none. Many people think of this as an isolationist viewpoint, but I disagree. We can still play a dominant role in global affairs without having to use force. Commerce, free trade, and diplomacy will get us much further than coercion could ever hope to achieve. I believe the ones who place sanctions on nations we have disagreements with are the ones who isolate us from the world. Our leaders claim sanctions are intended to affect the foreign nation's government, but in reality, it's the people who suffer the consequences. Take Iran, for example. We've been placing sanctions against them since 1979. Presidents Carter, Reagan, Clinton, Bush Jr., and Obama have all placed increasingly tough sanctions against Iran. This has had a devastating effect on their economy, and especially as of late. Their currency, the Royale, is currently experiencing hyperinflation, which wipes out the average person's savings. It's clear that the people are the ones who suffer the consequences of our sanctions. We've all been told that we're spreading democracy around the world and getting rid of brutal dictators, but sadly this is not the case. We have been an imperialist nation right from the start. Our nation's land and even resources were stolen from Native Americans, so it's quite naive to think that we're not doing something similar in foreign nations today. But it's important to realize that this is only possible through the government. In a free market with contracts based on between parties of mutual agreement, which we advocate, This would not be possible, as the oppression of third world nations for their resources would clearly violate the terms of those contracts.